One of the first things I came across when doing a bit of research for this brief talk was a Guardian article complaining about Ofsted's methods and their effect upon the morale of school teachers. And I thought, oh, this is now. When I looked at the date on the article, it was written in 1994. But it could just as easily have been written today. Because when you look through the last 33 years, what we see is how very little has changed, not only in Ofsted's practice, but in its institutional attitude. Its motto is raising standards, improving lives. But there's very little evidence, just put my phone off, apologies. There's very little evidence that it has ever done either of these things. I think this is because the way Ofsted works is based upon assumptions about education generally and schooling in particular that are quite simply wrong. Of these assumptions, the two most obviously mistaken are firstly that education and schooling are performative activities. This continues to pervade Ofsted's thinking. And secondly, that publicly humiliating school teachers, head teachers and other education staff somehow leads to improvement. I don't think that's true. So instead of starting in 1992 and working forward through 10 chief inspectors, God knows how many changes to the inspection framework and so on, only to find we've ended up where we began, I'm going to start with a true story. I was working in Wolverhampton when in 1993, November 1993, Northicote School became the very first school to fail its Ofsted inspection and to be put into special measures. As the inspection had been carried out by the authority's own team of poachers turned gamekeepers, this shouldn't have come as a surprise. But Wolverhampton Council's reaction to it was equally surprising. Northicote served a very deprived area. Its pupil numbers were well below capacity, and 70% of the children, and this is 1993, remember, not now, 70% of them were on the special educational needs register. 33% of them were eligible for free school meals. The state of the buildings, which were appallingly dilapidated, you could say were an obvious metaphor for the overall state of the school. The only reason it hadn't been closed before was that it was in a marginal council ward. So Wolverhampton Council now had a perfect excuse to close Northicote, but for reasons which I think are largely political, but way outside Wolverhampton Council's extent, it was decided instead that the school would be turned around. And the buildings were renovated at a cost of, in modern terms, about £500,000. And to his credit, the head, Jeff Hampton, he'd only been in post since September, rolled up his sleeves, grabbed a paintbrush and ran into the school in all his spare time and helped paint the walls and so forth, setting a good example of leadership. The school was supplied with all the latest facilities and equipment. A new uniform was introduced, and the authority engaged an HMI to work with a carefully chosen team of their own to oversee the implementation of the action plan for Northicote's renewal. Hampton was a good head. His energy and enthusiasm, his ability to reach out to the local community, and his understanding of school management led to a rapid improvement. Also, the children were quite cheered up, because for the first time ever in their lives, they were getting an awful lot of attention from newspapers and local TV, because this school had become something of a cause célèbre. And so they cooperated with Sir Jeff, well, he's Jeff at this point, Jeff's plan. The vacant places at the school began to fill up with children from other parts of Wolverhampton. And this led to a much needed rebalancing of the socio-economic intake of the school and also of the academic intake of the school. Within 2 years, Northicote was re-inspected and it came out of special measures. By 1998, things seemed to be going really well. And at this point, Jeff Hampton became Sir Jeff, thanks to Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister by now. And after 5 years of absolutely exhausting work, and who can blame him, he went off to be a professor at Wolverhampton University, where he taught about and wrote books about how to turn schools round. He was also invited to Downing Street to explain his ideas to Tony Blair. But 1998 turned out to be a high watermark in the history of the school. A year later, Ofsted returned, and they did find some good things. Enormous improvement in exam results, which had improved at 3 times the national average. Majority of the pupils making good progress. Financial management was very good. Links with the community were very good. But not nearly enough teaching could be described as good or very good. Monitoring of teaching was unsatisfactory. Pupils' personal development was poor. And sixth form provision was not good enough. Moreover, attendance at Northcote School was below the national average. Of course, this report was published, and the effect of this was to put a stop to the school's renaissance. Bit by bit, pupil numbers began to decline. By 2007, the school roll had fallen to an unsustainable size, and plans were made for it to be merged with another local secondary school to create a new academy. And this merger took effect 3 years later. After 4 years of the new academy sharing both sites, the Northcote site was sold for building, being finally demolished in 2018. There is very little now to show that Blackthorn Drive, Juniper Avenue, Douglas Fir Avenue, and other typically Wolverhampton arboreal streets are where there was once a school that had briefly commanded a great deal of attention. But the whole development is called Hampton Park, so Sir Geoff's name will live on. Strangely, Wolverhampton Highways Department continued to repaint the sign on the tarmac that said, "School, keep clear," for several years. They didn't notice it wasn't there anymore. So OFSTED, the Office for Standards in Education, the body that triggered this sad tale, came into being in 1992. It was almost the last piece in the apparatus first designed in the Education Reform Act of 1998 to turn market forces into the instrument of school improvement. It was also part of a long-term plan to diminish the role of local authorities and to centralise control in Westminster by standardising school practice, because once you've got Ofsted checklists, you are effectively saying what's got to happen in all aspects of school life. The first chief inspector was a distinguished academic, Professor Stuart Sutherland. He was a philosopher, and so it seemed to him quite natural to put it to the government that if Ofsted was going to be a really independent and trustworthy inspectorate, it ought to be able to analyse and publish critical reports of government education policy. This was very naive of him. Government education policy wasn't part of the idea at all. And they obviously told him to sling his hook. A year later, he left and became Vice-Chancellor of Edinburgh University. He was replaced by Chris Woodhead, a former English teacher who had moved from schools into teacher training and then into LE, local authority administration. Woodhead made no secret of his contempt for the teaching profession, stating on the basis of no serious evidence that there were at least 15,000 incompetent teachers who should be sacked, and that he saw an important part of his job as being to challenge mediocrity. Unsurprisingly, Woodhead engendered in the teaching profession a hatred of Ofsted, which persists to this day. When New Labour came to power in 1997, David Blunkett, the new Education Secretary, wanted to replace bad cop Woodhead with a good cop. But Woodhead had the ear of Tony Blair. So he stayed in post for a little bit longer until even Blair got fed up with him and replaced him with good cop David Bell. And that's a pattern, if you look through, of Ofsted's doings. Whenever the government thinks things are getting too much for the teaching profession, they sack the bad cop chief inspector and put in a good cop instead. And if you look through the list, you'll see there is this fairly clear pattern of alternating good cop and bad cop chief inspectors. But whether they're good cops or bad cops, they preside over the same institution. The hastily trained teams of inspectors employed as private contractors, in line with neoliberal ideology, began their work in 1993. The original plan was that the inspectors would all that is, be drawn from non-educational backgrounds, i.e. none of them would be able to contradict anything the Department for Education said. But eventually the government was persuaded that this was not very practical. So they settled for insisting that every team of inspectors must contain one lay inspector, who presumably functioned there as a token. Inspectors were required to assess schools in accordance with an inspection framework, basically a checklist, a further instrument of standardisation. This led to schools being obliged to produce mountains of paperwork containing details of policies that inspectors could check. Goes on to this day. The first framework, for example, was quite short. required inspectors to judge schools on 4 criteria: the quality of education provided by the school, the standard of education achieved by the school, I assume that's exam results, differentiated from the first one, the efficiency of the school's financial management, and the spiritual, moral, social and cultural development of the pupils. I think we can probably blame the first Chief Inspector, Stuart Sutherland, for that. Even the most insightful and empathetic inspectors, I'm sure there are some, would struggle to make a useful assessment of this in just a week, which explains the need for all the paperwork. There's no way you can inspect a school and discern truths about things like the moral development of the pupils in a week. What you can do, of course, is read policies and assess whether or not there is a policy in place. Originally, schools are to be graded under 5 categories, ranging from grade 1, excellent, to grade 5, unsatisfactory. In 1996, the Eorich Woodhead added 2 more grades, poor and very poor. Schools received unsatisfactory or worse will be put into special measures and made subject to an action plan, which would often include the removal of the head teacher. OFSTED reports will be made public, and by 1994, the government was gleefully referring to the naming and shaming of failing schools. Now, the idea that schools can be made to improve by publicly humiliating their staff is not one that's commonly held in the education systems of advanced economies, and it can have very serious consequences, which brings me on to my second story, the case of Caversham Primary School in Reading, whose head teacher, Ruth Perry, committed suicide after her school was downgraded by Ofsted from outstanding to inadequate after a 2-day visit. Ruth Perry's suicide was not the first death associated with an Ofsted inspection. The coroner's report following the inquest into her death was actually, believe it or not, the 10th coroner's report in which an Ofsted inspection had been mentioned as at least a contributing factor in the death of a school teacher. But there were 2 main reasons why Ruth's death became such a cause célèbre. One was the campaign begun by her sister, Professor Julia Waters, to publicise the inhumanity of which Ofsted is capable, a fact recognised in the coroner's report. The other was that the judgment of inadequate was seen by the school's parents as a gross travesty. I'd like to read you just a short extract from an article written by one of the Caversham primary parents and published in The Guardian not long after Ruth's death. Caversham Primary School was where our daughter would very soon begin the next stage of her young life, and we knew she would be entering an outstanding school. We knew it was outstanding because Ofsted had told us so. More importantly, we knew it was outstanding because our son was already attending the school and he loves it there. He is thriving academically, but more importantly, he is happy and is growing into a warm, kind little person who respects others and seeks to understand the world around him. These are the values he's exposed to on a daily basis at Caversham Primary. They were the values clearly expressed and driven by the head teacher, Ruth Perry. When deciding which school we would most like him to attend, Mrs. Perry's love for her school was a powerful influence. She had attended Caversham Primary as a child herself, and then dedicated her professional career to the school. And the passion in her voice when she spoke about it told us that she was totally committed to ensuring that its new generation of pupils had the same wonderful start in life that she felt she had been gifted there. It seemed impossible to comprehend a teacher more dedicated to their school, more invested in its success, more caring for its children. And we were delighted to secure a place for our son and then our daughter. After Ruth's death, quite a lot of Caversham primary parents came forward and said similar things. And this judgment of inadequate was due to the finding that there were serious weaknesses in the school's safeguarding policies and practice. In the case of the policies, some paperwork was missing, a problem which could have been remedied extremely easily. In the case of the practice, the lead inspector, who had already said to one of his colleagues that he thought the school was a happy school, that the children were very safe and well looked after, and indeed his colleague gave evidence of this to the inquest. The next day was confined like the children indoors because it was a rainy lunch hour. Anyone here who's ever worked in a school knows that rainy lunch hours, especially in primary schools, can be rather fraught. Passengers' time, yeah. And the children were a bit fractious. So he saw a boy practicing a dance copied from a popular video game. Apparently, and this is completely unknown to me, I'm far too old, a flossing dance. So it's nothing to do with tooth cleaning, I believe. And he concluded, just from this observation, which he did not take any further, and what he did was he didn't investigate it, he concluded that the school had allowed, quote, a sexualised culture, unquote, to develop among the children. Later in the same lunch hour, he observed two boys scuffling, which you might see on a rainy lunch hour in a primary school, and wrote down this incident as an example of, quote, child-on-child abuse, unquote. Both of these things were cited in his report as evidence of failings in safeguarding. The general public thinks that Ofsted judgments are objective and brought about by the collection and dispassionate examination of evidence. The case of Caversham Primary shows that this is simply untrue. The coroner's scathing judgment on the way the inspection had been carried out produced a response from Ofsted described by Christine Gilbert, herself a former chief inspector, as defensive and complacent. And there has been little sign of Ofsted's acknowledging that its inspection of Caversham Primary School was a serious case of institutional failure. As for the government, its response has been yet another tweak to the inspection framework. And that's, I'm afraid, a very common sort of state of affairs. Oh, I should add, in defence of Ofsted, the then chief inspector thought she should put on a half-day afternoon course for inspectors to deal with the problem of possible stress among school staff during an inspection. That was their total response. School inspection can be a very good thing, but not if it's based on mistaken assumptions. Sadly, as we've seen in the two cases I've described, one from the beginning of this period of time and one from the end, no government since 1992 seems to have realised this. So today we're going to hear about other ways of doing it. So thank you.